Right then guys, here I am for another video on F1 2019, and in this video I'll be summarising the driver changes I've experienced having completed 5 seasons of career mode. Now I should point out straight away that this video isn't going to be as informative as I hoped it would be because, well, I can't concrete confirm how the driver changes work. There's 2 systems at play so far as I can see. The first one determining who changes teams, and the second one determining the pace gaps between new teammates. Now I have no idea how that works, and I think to really concrete confirm it you'd have to go into the game's files, but I was hoping that I would be able to reasonably confidently theorise how the driver transfers work, but I can't. And it's not helped by the fact that most of this recording was done on version 1.04 of the game. I delayed installing version 1.05 of the game deliberately, so I didn't install it until just after I started the 5th season of career mode. I took part in one race, I simulated the 2nd race of the season, then I installed version 1.05, and installing that update changed a lot because I just come to accept, not understand but accept what was going on, what had happened in the Formula 1 world. I installed the update, suddenly it all changed completely. So even if I had understood it on version 1.04, version 1.05 contradicts a large part of what existed beforehand. So this is really just going to be me describing what I've experienced, not really explaining it, because it is near impossible to explain just through observing it. Before I get into what happened in the 1st season of my career mode, I do want to talk about what happened in my very first season of career mode, in my very first career save. I abandoned that save because at the end of the 1st season I got fired from Williams. Now normally I wouldn't mention what happened in this career mode save, it's gone, it's not canonical. However, the driver transfer that happened mid-season concerned Lance Stroll. Now you may be wondering why I care about Lance Stroll. However, Racing Point and Alfa Romeo are the only 2 teams which I've personally noticed that have clear disparities between the pace of one driver and the pace of another. The reason that's interesting is because in Codemasters F1 games of old, the pace of a driver has been determined by 2 things. Firstly, the car they're in, obviously, but second of all, there is a programmed pace gap between teammates. That's why in F1 games of old, it has been a poison chalice to be a teammate of Fernando Alonso. Button I don't think came off too badly, but Van Dorn did. Then going all the way back to F1 2012, Felipe Massa got slapped by Fernando Alonso because the programmed in pace gap between Alonso and Massa was chasmic. The thing is though, Lance Stroll has a programmed in pace deficit to Sergio Perez. I really doubt that's changed. As I said, I haven't gone into the game's files, but people have, and in the game's files, Racing Point are still called Force India. So clearly behind the scenes there haven't been any major changes. Perez is much quicker than Lance Stroll, and the driver transfer that happened at the Austrian Grand Prix was Ricciardo went to Racing Point, so Stroll went to Renault. Now at that point in the championship, Stroll had 2 points. Perez, his teammate, had 25. So I think it's fair to say Perez is much quicker than Lance Stroll. Also at Renault, Ricciardo had 39 points, Hülkenberg 26. By the end of the season, Lance Stroll still had 2 points. He never scored a single point at Renault. Now that's despite the fact Renault started off and ended the season quicker than Racing Point. Lance Stroll scored 0 points in the same time frame that Hülkenberg scored 11. The biggest mystery is what happened to Renault. pre the Austrian Grand Prix, Ricciardo and Hülkenberg, the two original Renault drivers, had more points than both Racing Point drivers. Yeah, sure, Hülkenberg had only 1 point more than Perez, but even still, 1 point more. By the end of the season, Perez had 49 points more than Hülkenberg, and neither Perez nor Hülkenberg moved teams. And as I said, Renault started and ended the season quicker than Racing Point. Seemingly, Renault's downward spiral coincided with Lance Stroll joining the team. Lance Stroll doing badly in races I can understand. Lance Stroll doing far worse than Hülkenberg I can understand, but Hülkenberg doing poorly in races I just don't get. Not once you factor in how quick the Renault car was all season long. It almost seems like Lance Stroll single-handedly brought down the Renault team, and also, conversely, him leaving Racing Point elevated the team further up the order. So now onto what happened in the first season of my still standing career mode save. And I have to say the mid-season driver transfer was actually far less interesting. Grosjean went to Renault and Hülkenberg to Haas. Now, I think Hülkenberg chose to go to Haas, but it's interesting why he would choose to go there. However, coincidentally, at the Austrian Grand Prix, the race where the driver transfer happened, Haas just so happened to have overtaken Renault in terms of car development. Haas started the season behind Renault and spent most of the season with a slower car than Renault. However, at the Austrian Grand Prix and also at the end of the season, they just so happened to have a quicker car than Renault. Hülkenberg joined Haas with 24 points more than Magnussen. He ended with 64 points more than the Dane. He gained 40 points in just over half a season. It was a similar story at Renault. Ricciardo started off with 28 points more than Grosjean. He ended 45 ahead of his new teammate. So long the short of it, both of the original Renault drivers were quicker than both of the original Haas drivers. At the start of the second season, Max Verstappen went to McLaren, which meant Lando Norris went to Red Bull. By the end of the first season, McLaren had a quicker car than Red Bull, and that was still true come the start of the second season. Anyway, in the Australian Grand Prix, despite the fact McLaren had a quicker car than Red Bull, Lando Norris, the Red Bull driver, started and finished the race in 5th. Verstappen led a McLaren 8-9, whilst Pierre Gasly in the other Red Bull finished in 11th, having started in 16th. There were no grid penalties, he genuinely qualified in 16th. That was the Australian Grand Prix. Come the end of the season, Verstappen thrashed Sainz. Max got 219 points, Sainz got 135. Meanwhile, at Red Bull, Lando Norris beat Pierre Gasly by a mile, proportionately speaking anyway, as Norris got 46 points, Pierre Gasly 27. Now, the results of those teammate battles are interesting because at the end of Season 1, Verstappen scored 200 points, Gasly 160, meanwhile at McLaren, Sainz got 15, Norris 12. Long the short of it, in the second season, Red Bull had both of the inferior drivers, whilst McLaren had the best Red Bull driver and the best McLaren driver. For Red Bull, a quicker team to have quicker drivers, that sort of makes sense. I mean, ignoring anybody's judgment on how good Verstappen is relative to Sainz in real life, you know, ignoring any sort of subjective or presumptuous judgment on how quick Verstappen is relative to Sainz or how quick Gasly is compared to Norris. If you're going based purely on game logic, for Red Bull to have quicker drivers, that would make sense, but then Norris, a McLaren driver, beat Gasly, so it doesn't really make sense, because Verstappen beat Sainz, that's a battle of number 1 drivers, but then Norris beat Gasly in the battle of number 2 drivers, and I really don't get it because, as I said, the pace gap between teammates is determined by a pre-programmed in time delta. So I don't know how the game can work out whether one driver from one team is quicker than another driver from another team. There weren't any more driver changes until the start of the third season, but it was worth the wait, as Hamilton and Vettel both went to Toro Rosso, whilst Bottas went to Haas. that meant Albon was sent, and I really do mean sent, to Ferrari, Kvyat to Mercedes, and Magnussen also to Mercedes. Toro Rosso ended the second season as the quickest team and Haas the second quickest, hence why Hamilton, Vettel and Bottas rushed over to them. I think the top drivers do have priority in choosing what team they want to go to, and if you look at the announcement of driver moves, it lists Hamilton, then Vettel, then Bottas. Albon, Kvyat and Magnussen are mentioned at the bottom three. Ultimately, I think Hamilton, because he saw Toro Rosso were now the quickest team, and I think he's got top priority based on the fact he's the quickest driver, he's in the quickest team, he's last season's Drivers' Champion. I think he's got top priority to do whatever he likes within reason, so he joined Toro Rosso. Vettel second on the priority because, well, he's Ferrari's main man, he is second in the Drivers' Championship last season, so I think Vettel second priority, Bottas third priority, and that's it. Because there is a free driver transfer limit at any one time, that's it. But I think if you extended that to 4 driver transfers that can happen at any one time, I think the 4th driver to have moved would have been Leclerc, and Leclerc would have gone to Haas, because, well, Hamilton and Vettel, the first 2 to move, they went to the top team. Bottas, he could move, so he went to the second best team. Leclerc, I presume, would have been the next driver, so he would have gone to the other seat at the second best team. It seems weird that Albon wouldn't want to go to Ferrari or Kvyat or Magnussen to Mercedes, but quite frankly, I think Hamilton, Vettel and Bottas wanted their seats, so they had to vacate them. Quite frankly, I don't think they had a say in it. Just to point out how shaken up the Formula 1 world is already, this was the podium for the 2021 Australian Grand Prix. Nico Hülkenberg in a Haas won. Sebastian Vettel in a Toro Rosso, and there's so many things about that move which I find unlikely. I find it basically implausible that Toro Rosso would ever be quick enough to convince Vettel to join them. I find it unlikely Toro Rosso would want Vettel back, or even Red Bull for that matter. I don't think Red Bull as a company would want Sebastian Vettel back in one of their teams. I find it implausible that Vettel would want to join Toro Rosso again, and I find it totally implausible that Sebastian Vettel would agree to be teammates to Lewis Hamilton. Speaking of which, Hamilton's former teammate, now also at Haas, finished in 3rd place. Meanwhile, Hamilton started the race in 14th. Vettel in 11th, and that's really something to be talked about in another video, but even still, Hamilton, despite starting in 14th, 3 places behind Sebastian Vettel, he finished in 6th place, so 4 places behind Sebastian Vettel, but Hamilton made up 8 positions in that Grand Prix, and he beat both McLarens, which interestingly were led by Sainz, not Verstappen. There was another driver swap that season, this time at the Belgian Grand Prix, as Hülkenberg went to McLaren and Sainz to Haas. Sounds pretty uninteresting, but that is the equivalent of, at the end of this month, Vettel announcing he's going to Mercedes and Hamilton going to Ferrari, because at this point in the season, McLaren and Haas were the 2 best teams in F1. Lewis Hamilton, driving for Toro Rosso, won the Drivers' Championship in the United States of America, so with 2 races left to go. And at the end of the season, he beat Vettel, his teammate, by 81 points. Albon in the Ferrari scored 43 points, whilst his teammate Leclerc scored 99. Kvyat and Magnussen, both at Mercedes, were fairly even, with Kvyat scoring 122 points and Magnussen 120. Come the start of the 4th season, Sebastian Vettel went back to Ferrari and Albon to Toro Rosso. Ferrari ended the 3rd season as the quickest team, with Toro Rosso the 5th quickest. So you can sort of understand why Vettel would want to go back to Ferrari, except he ignored something which I think was glaringly obvious, to me at least, because I saw this coming. There were 2 rule changes set to happen during the off-season, and Toro Rosso stopped developing almost immediately into the 3rd season, possibly because they didn't have any more upgrades they could fit. But whatever the reason, they had ample time and resource points to be able to keep all of their upgrades, whereas Ferrari, the only reason they ended the third season as the quickest team was because they insisted on developing right until the very end, so they didn't really prepare very well for the rule changes, and so as such, at the start of the fourth season, Toro Rosso were the second best team and Ferrari the fifth quickest. At the start of the Japanese Grand Prix race weekend, Lewis Hamilton went back to Mercedes, replacing Magnussen, who went to Toro Rosso. Hamilton left presumably because Toro Rosso no longer had the quickest car, and even Mercedes had passed them by that point. Hamilton was leading the Drivers' Championship by a long way when he left, and his teammate Albon had 201 points less and never finished on the podium, whereas Hamilton that season had never not finished on the podium. It also begs the question why he left. Why would you leave Toro Rosso when your race record is so good and it's not even like it dipped off? Yeah, sure, he went from getting straight race wins to getting a few second place finishes, but he had been at the team all season long, the car was still quick, he was still getting results, and he was still leading the Drivers' Championship. Why would he leave to go to Mercedes? And it's not like it was anything to do with Magnussen. There is no way Magnussen initiated that move. Because, well, he can't have done, but also, why would he want to leave Mercedes to go to Toro Rosso? That's the thing, Lewis Hamilton is top of the tree, he can do what he likes with regards to driver moves. If he wants to go somewhere, he goes there, there is nothing anyone can do. Hamilton won another Drivers' Championship, and he did it yet again in the United States of America. Only his third race with Mercedes after he left Toro Rosso to rejoin them. He celebrated his Drivers' Championship win with the Mercedes team, even though most of the work done towards it was with Toro Rosso. Magnussen joined Toro Rosso with 32 points less than Albon, and he ended the season with only 8 less. He caught up 24 points from the Japanese Grand Prix to the end of the season. Bottas beat Sainz in the Drivers' Championship, so the thing clearly the best driver at Haas. And in the McLaren inter-team battle, Hulkenberg beat Verstappen. That is key information, you have got to remember that. Hulkenberg beat Verstappen. Season 5 started off with a couple of driver transfers being announced. Albon went to Mercedes, meaning he is teammates with Lewis Hamilton yet again. And it also means Kvyat is back to Toro Rosso. Also, Kimi Raikkonen went to Renault and Grosjean Alfa Romeo. The Bahrain Grand Prix in Season 5 was the final race I did before I installed version 1.05 because I wanted a simmed race results screen to look at and compare to future simmed race results screens in that same season to see if installing version 1.05 caused any major or distinct changes. Well, let me run you down through the results of the Bahrain Grand Prix as Nico Hulkenberg was the leading McLaren yet again, as he finished in second with Verstappen in fourth. Bottas won the Grand Prix with Carlos Sainz in fifth. Hamilton in the Mercedes finished in third with his teammate Albon in seventh. Raikkonen, now in the Renault, finished in 12th, with Ricciardo in 15th. Finally, Grosjean in the Alfa Romeo beat Giovinazzi as Grosjean finished in 13th and Giovinazzi 17th. Then I installed version 1.05 and the first thing it did was update the team performances. So McLaren went from having the quickest car to the quickest car by a landslide. McLaren were now unstoppable. So it was a foregone conclusion that McLaren were going to win both championships that season. Hulkenberg beat Verstappen in the previous season, and in both of the races this season he beat Verstappen. So logically Hulkenberg should have comfortably beaten his Dutch teammate. But installing version 1.05 caused Verstappen to become the quickest McLaren driver. And not just slightly quicker than Hulkenberg, he was miles faster. Hulkenberg could not compete with Verstappen, despite the fact he had in previous seasons, despite the fact he was easily able to beat Verstappen on version 1.04. On version 1.05, Verstappen was dominant. No one could hold a candle to Verstappen. He won the Drivers' Championship in Mexico with 3 races left to go. In total, he scored 492 points out of a maximum of 525. his teammate Hulkenberg scored 146 less, nearly 6 race wins worth. That's the front page story of the season, but I should also point out that at the Japanese Grand Prix, George Russell finally entered Formula 1. He replaced Leclerc at Ferrari, meaning Leclerc joined Renault, and so Kimi Raikkonen is out of Formula 1. Renault had the third quickest car by this point, so you can understand why Leclerc was happy to leave Ferrari to join Renault. Leclerc joined Renault with 1 point more than Ricciardo, but ended the season with 55 more. George Russell scored only 1 point whilst at Ferrari. Vettel scored 62 points total and 24 since Russell joined. Going back to Renault though, it's clear that Leclerc was much better than Ricciardo. So is Kimi Raikkonen. At the start of the season, you see, that was another one of the things to change with version 1.05. Kimi Raikkonen on version 1.04 was much quicker than Daniel Ricciardo, but then version 1.05 came around and suddenly Ricciardo was much quicker than Raikkonen. That wasn't the only thing to change. Not only was it Verstappen and Hulkenberg and Raikkonen and Ricciardo, Hamilton by the end of the season only scored 7 points more than Albon. And that's despite the fact Albon had 2 car slowdown issues and 1 retirement in that season. So actually, once you factor in reliability, Albon was quicker than Lewis Hamilton. That is certainly not how it was during the Toro Rosso and Mercedes days on version 1.04. Sainz overtook Bottas in the Drivers' Championship at the final race to beat him by 3 points. And let's not forget, last season, Valtteri Bottas beat Carlos Sainz in the Drivers' Championship. So yet again, that's another teammate battle that has swung the other way just by installing version 1.05. Finally, Giovinazzi scored 3 points, whilst his Alfa Romeo teammate Romain Grosjean scored none. And that's despite the fact, yet again, at the start of the season, Grosjean was much quicker than Giovinazzi. And that is pretty much everything I have to show you guys, but I may as well end off with what driver transfers I got at the start of Season 6. Sergio Perez joins Mercedes, swapping with Albon, who goes to Racing Point. Daniel Ricciardo goes to Haas to partner Valtteri Bottas, and Sebastian Vettel goes to Renault to reunite with Charles Leclerc. Carlos Sainz has gone to Racing Point, meaning Lawrence Stroll is out of F1, but that means Kimi Raikkonen, at 44 years old, is back in F1 and is back at Ferrari, partnering George Russell. I'm still yet to do most of Season 6, so I don't know how those drivers fare at their new teams, but we'll find out in the all 10 seasons of Career Mode video, which I'll release later on in the year. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this, effectively precursor to the all 10 seasons of Career Mode video, and I'll see you guys in my next video.